Thank you so much, Julie. And Helen Lewis, over to you.
Well, my entry into this debate begins where Julie left off. It was January 2013, and I was editing the website of the New Statesman, which is a left-leaning British magazine. I'd hit upon the idea of running theme weeks on the website to explore important political issues in depth, and so I commissioned one called Trans Issues Week. For anyone interested in equality, it should be obvious that trans people are subject to harassment simply for the way they express their gender identity, I wrote in the introduction. That post now feels like a time capsule. Most of it I stand by. It is hard to be visibly transgender, to be visibly non-conforming, and I've never wanted to make anyone's life harder. Now, though, I wouldn't use those words, gender identity, and that's because of what happened next. A few months ago, someone suggested to me the reason I'd had so much grief for my writing on this issue is that I arrived to it too early. I quibbled at the time, but I actually think that's right. I think it's true of Julie too. In his book, The Identity Trap, Yasha Monk talks about the short march through the institutions by a particular kind of identity-based ideology. And nowhere is that more obvious than in trans activism. When I started writing about trans issues, I thought I was supporting a movement for human dignity. Trans women want to be treated like women, to use female names and female pronouns to soothe their gender dysphoria. Of course, they weren't female, and some protections in law were written specifically for biological females, so those wouldn't be included. But I quickly discovered that wasn't the case, that some people found any discussion of vaginas and ovaries in relation to womanhood appalling, yet many of those same people had no problem identifying who to bully on the internet. I started writing about gender because no one was paying attention to what was happening. No one would put a rapist in a female jail, we were told. There was no conflict between women's rights and trans rights. Puberty blockers were a life-saving intervention, administered only after a careful clinical process. That was the gaslighting era. We are now in the culture war era. Back in the mid-2010s, what made so many liberals resistant to hearing the feminist critique of gender was the assumption that trans activism was merely the continuation of the gay rights movement. I certainly did, and I know why. It's hard to remember now, but the 90s and noughties were cruel to trans people in the same way they were cruel to women. In the film Ace Ventura, the big twist is that the police detective Lois Einhorn is, in the words of the film, a man. Remembering that he kissed her, Jim Carrey's Ace Ventura then mimes his disgust for several minutes, vomiting into the toilet, using a plunger on his face, squeezing a whole tube of toothpaste into his mouth. Another way to see how casually cruel people used to be about trannies is to find a man ranting at feminists on Twitter to be kind, and then search his tweets from about 2012. It always works. What shifted my view further was an open letter, that plague upon the earth, circulated by the lobby group Trans Media Watch in September 2013. A representative of the group asked me to sign it and to promote it in the New Statesman. You can tell how long ago this was by the fact that trans in the letter is followed by an asterisk, something we were told at the time was vitally important in something, but was dropped 5 minutes later. It was the first intimation that this movement was the child of Judith Butler, obsessed with using jargon to carve out an enlightened us and a despicable them. Now, I became a journalist because I am not a joiner in. I wanted to run a website where issues were debated, so I wasn't going to sign myself or my organisation up to a single interpretation of the truth. I didn't sign that letter. That put me out of step with the school of feminism that was then sweeping through Tumblr and Twitter, obsessed with status and purity and disassociating itself from the icky second wave. It also put me out of step with the shift in progressive politics that became obvious in the mid-2010s, after Britain and the US passed gay marriage legislation, often with the support of conservatives. Matt Iglesias summed up the new orthodoxy like this, that there is a set of identity-linked issues that are beyond the scope of normal political give and take. In Britain, this was packaged as the idea that refusing to say that trans women were women was the same as questioning their right to exist. Or it can be summed up even more briskly, as Stonewall did. No debate. During that gaslighting era, left-wing journalists too often unthinkingly accepted what they were told by charities and activists. After all, weren't they all on the same side? New style guides were offered, dictating what could and couldn't be said. No to single-sex spaces. No to dead naming. Yes to sex assigned at birth. Sex change surgery became gender reassignment surgery, became gender confirmation surgery. A teenager having an elective double mastectomy was softened into someone being affirmed through top surgery. Male-bodied was taboo, because who was to say that the penis was a male sexual organ? This language was deeply political, and it often served to obfuscate. If I tell you that a trans activist attacked a TERF at Speaker's Corner, I'm denying the extremely relevant information that a tall, strong, 20-something male physically assaulted a woman in her 60s. Talking about the spike in gender referrals in the 2010s also requires the context that spike was almost entirely driven by natal females, girls, the same group most prone to social contagion. Talking about rape requires the acknowledgement that 98% of sexual violence is committed by males, according to the ONS. The trans activist movement of the 2010s was hostile to journalists because it wanted to make so many things unsayable. The things I've said are, even now, hard to say in many liberal media outlets because they would be deemed anti-trans. At the same time that some charities and lobby groups were insisting that civil rights issues were exempt from normal scrutiny, discussion, and compromise, those same charities and lobby groups were pushing for vast changes to the law. And that's what really prompted my entry into the trans debate. In 2015, the expensive cheap Maria Miller decided to give her political career a new act by using her Women and Equality Select Committee report to recommend self-ID. She did this even though representatives from the prison service suggested at the time that sex offenders might exploit such provisions. Maria Miller's committee did not invite any gender-critical groups to testify, which is more understandable when you realise how few such groups existed in 2015. The domestic violence charity NIA, of which I was once chair, was a lonely example standing up for single-sex provision. Women's Aid told the inquiry it aimed to accommodate trans women wherever possible, in a tone implying this was no big deal and that no one reasonable could object. More gaslighting. Back then, trans groups had a large and well-funded infrastructure thanks to Stonewall, Gendered Intelligence, and the rest. Women's organisations were largely caught napping. The gender-critical movement owes a huge debt to women like Julie, who raised the alarm early, as well as campaigners like Nicola Williams, Stephanie Davis-Sarai, and Karen Ngala-Smith of NIA, who all cared more about informing policy than getting the credit. As a journalist, I won't take dictation from activists, but I'm extremely grateful when I encounter experts who really know their stuff. After the Miller inquiry reported, I wrote articles to oppose self-identification and to call out this blinkered and biased approach to policymaking. Then I got all the backlash you would expect those positions to attract, and I wrote about that too. It seemed so obviously misogynist to me that I couldn't understand why other people couldn't see it, or why they were pretending not to see it. For a while, though, the Stonewall tactics worked. Theresa May went to the Pink News Awards, and the Tory party backed self-ID. Jeremy Corbyn went too and cleared up any confusion we might have had by declaring that his pronouns were he, him. In the gaslighting era, gender-critical feminists were completely shut out of the conversation on the left, while the right hadn't yet seen the electoral potential of saying things like, women don't have penises. It felt very lonely. You were simultaneously a genital-obsessed wingnut intent on genocide and someone writing about trivialities rather than serious manly politics. And that word TERF, we all knew what it meant. Bitch, cunt, hag, crone, harpy, all the words that have been thrown at women all through history to isolate them with their dangerous opinions. For a while, though, it felt like the New Statesman was one of the only places for feminists to voice their misgivings, which they did despite the personal and professional risks. We ran a pseudonymous piece by an academic headlined, "Are you now or have you ever been a TERF?" We ran Rachel Hewitt's incredible essay on how single-sex spaces helped her heal after being raped. We ran Glosswitch and Sarah Ditum and Suzanne Moore, and we ran the other side of the debate too, when a few brave trans activists dared to disobey their own side and make arguments rather than loftily refuse to engage. And make no mistake, it was hard being a dissident trans activist. When Gia Milinovic put together a skeptics event on gender featuring 2 trans panelists, they got an incredible amount of grief from their small, close-knit communities. The incentives in LGBT spaces all pointed towards no platform and no debate. Both the extreme right and the extreme left chose to play to their base. They both chose culture war over compromise. Gradually, though, the kind of journalists I respect, the ones who read the evidence, talk to sources, think things through, rather than taking their opinions ready-made off a shelf named left or right, became involved. Janice Turner wrote about the issue in The Times. James Kirkup developed an incredible knowledge of the policy implications of self-ID and wrote about it in The Spectator. Caroline Criado Perez wrote about her refusal to call herself cis, another one of those words we were assured would be ubiquitous within a decade. Julie continued to write about women, bloody but unbowed. Becca Riley Cooper explored the philosophical arguments for gender as a spectrum, an essay I still hear cited today. A Woman's Place found those who had been personally affected by the campaign of silencing and invited them to speak, demonstrating to skeptical journalists that there was a story here. Today, the picture has been transformed utterly, with organisations like Sex Matters, For Women Scotland, and Murray Blackburn Mackenzie all developing the kind of legal expertise that ensures a real policy debate is now possible, and lawyers like Anya Palmer taking the fight to the courts. That's incredible. But I do want to end on a warning. I came to this subject because of my background in writing about feminism. Where the issue once had far too little light shone on it, now it is a nuclear missile for reactionaries to deploy against the left. This is the culture war era, and we are now in it. Many conservatives have entered discussion because of a sincere concern over women's rights, and that's wonderful too. This isn't about partisanship or purity politics. But we have to acknowledge the trans debate has attracted narcissists and grifters, monomaniacs and extremists, and commentators who don't give a shit about women, but know that there are clicks and applause in dunking on irritating students and queer theory academics. It has attracted people who throw around words like groomer, people who are genuinely transphobic, people who hate butch women and femme men, people like Hungary's liberal leader Viktor Orban, whose government no longer allows citizens to change their names to fit their own sense of gender, or the Polish right, who promised during the election to create LGBT ideology-free zones. And you bet your life I'm going to write about that. Journalists can write productively by working with activists, by representing them fairly, by giving airtime to important debates, by pushing back on misrepresentation.